I think we have a fun task ahead here just to talk about the future. And it's one of the probably more helpful things that we can do as the work around the Interagency Council proceeds is try to collectively support developing a coherent and frankly useful action plan. I know we had a great discussion in our breakout session, and it was clear we don't have all the answers. And I think if we had all the answers, then this would be really easy. I'm really thrilled that we have three experts as part of this afternoon's discussion, and they each bring with them a variety of insights and history and different projects that they've worked on that all sort of connect in different ways to the themes that we're talking about, and ultimately will hopefully be beneficial for the work around economic mobility. I want to just echo before we turn to the speakers that Ted McCann, and I'm not sure if Ted's still on, the 5 or 6 things that he mentioned as the role and the relevance of evidence in driving some of the decisions. He specifically highlighted the fact that Congress really wants to be able to use this kind of information. I'd say that is also true in executive branch agencies, but that we don't always have what people need or want. And so that's going to be a critical part of this discussion, is how do we better build up the evidence base and devise the strategies to answer the questions that people actually have and get the policymakers the information that they really need. So with that, I want to introduce just our 3 speakers. You can see them now. Their cameras are all on. Sara Dube is the director of the Results First Initiative at the Pew Charitable Trust. Julia Lane, I'm going to say indefatigable Julia Lane is, she wears many hats, including as a professor at NYU's Wagner School, and is co-founder of the Coleridge Initiative, which you'll most certainly hear more about. And David Williams, who's the Director of Policy Outreach at Opportunity Insights. So welcome to our 3 speakers, and let's just dive right in. So each of you have an incredible history and background. You've worked on tons of projects that are relevant to today's discussion. I want to just kind of give you a softball question and open it up and let you give us some perspective on some of the quick hits of initiatives that you've worked on that are relevant for informing how we think about improving the economic mobility space, specifically the outcomes measurement and building up the evidence base going forward. Sara, can we start with you?
Sure thing. Can you hear me okay? Great. Hi, Nick, and hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me here today. As an initiative to consider with all this work, I will officially say mine. I direct the Results First Initiative at the Pew Charitable Trust, and for the past decade or so, we've been working directly with state and local governments around the country to do pretty much everything evidence-based policymaking. So to essentially, at its core, get leaders to incorporate evidence into various aspects of budget and policymaking decisions. That's very broad, intentionally broad, and really designed to kind of meet people where they are. But we definitely have done a lot of work in terms of identifying, helping state leaders and local leaders identify and measure outcomes. And, I think that one of the things that I'll just share, and I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit later, is, in addition to obviously the great importance of finding those common measures, is really making sure they're used. We've found time and again with decision makers at the state and local level that there's all sorts of great information that is being discussed, but it's really important. And I think one of the things that Results First has done well is ensure that important outcome measures are actually part of the decision-making conversation and are in the hands of decision makers. So making sure that feedback loop is in place and actually being used. So that's something that I think we've seen successful in terms of some state level initiatives.
And Sara, of course, being used, one of the critical components of that is being useful in the first instance. Are there any clear indicators of ways that this group and others can sort of think about how you ensure something is useful as the starting point as you're encouraging this use? What were the interactions that you had with states around that question?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the Let's see, there's been a lot of examples over the years, but we've done a lot of work with the state of Colorado, and I know that Colorado was represented on the state lessons learned panel last week, specifically the Department of Human Services, I believe. And I think one of the things that they have done well to make outcome measurement across a variety of policy areas both used and useful, as you mentioned, is really to take stock often of whether or not things are working, right? And to make sure that that when things are not working, they actually make adjustments. They're really good at using a mix of process measures and outcome measures and making adjustments as needed. So I'd say that, yeah, the folks in Colorado have done a good job of recognizing the importance of process measures, that, you know, the ultimate outcome is not the only thing that matters, and then recognizing the need that in order to make things used and useful, to make adjustments along the way.
All right, thank you. David, can we turn to you next? Initiatives that are relevant for this conversation?
Yes, absolutely. Hopefully everyone can hear me. So kind of a quick background. So Opportunity Insights, we're a research and policy institute founded by economics professors at Harvard and Brown. I'm not an economist. I'm a lawyer by training. I work in the mayor's office in Detroit. So it's my job to kind of help fit down how we use big data and research to impact policymaking. And a couple of initiatives that we've worked on recently that I think are especially relevant to some of the conversations we were having in the breakout room. So one is kind of using IRS and Census Bureau data to create, you know, a potentially standard indicator of economic mobility. And so what we look at specifically are for kids who grow up in low-income families, basically using that data to track their outcomes in adulthood. So specifically looking at their incomes in adulthood, right? So kind of getting that intergenerational longitudinal sense of kind of how low-income kids specifically are doing later in life. And so we created an online tool called the Opportunity Atlas that looks at that particular economic mobility rate basically for every region and every neighborhood across the country. And I think similarly, right, you can kind of use that same data to track different impacts of programs as well, right? So I think that's kind of one example of how we can potentially use big data like that to create these different metrics of upward mobility, of economic mobility. When talking to policymakers, right, I think a lot of the conversation we had in the breakout rooms was, hey, that's really interesting to be able to track those long-term outcomes, right? But if you're a policymaker, if you're in my former mayor's office, right, you can't necessarily wait 10, 15, 20 years if your program is effective. So something we've been working on is called the surrogate index, and basically trying to create rigorous short-term indicators of these long-term outcomes. So something we're doing is kind of trying to partner with folks who've done historical evaluations of different programs, kind of track and see, you know, right, what were those 1, 2, 3-year outcomes that are most predictive of those longer term outcomes we care about. So, you know, hopefully creating a library of those interim indicators that could be kind of used for a range of different programs and policies. I think the third thing we hear from different policymakers is, right, how do we actually make those value judgments around different kinds of programs, right? So if we have limited funds or resources, or how do we decide where we're investing our dollars? And so Nathan Hendren, one of our principal investigators, did a project looking at what he calls the marginal value of public funds. So basically being able to kind of compare the ROI of different programs by both looking at kind of what someone's willingness to pay for that service or program and what is the net cost to that beneficiary, right? So when you have different kind of programs that have different kinds of outcomes, trying to create kind of one objective measure that can help give us a better sense of, right, the return on investment in a certain sense of these different types of programs. And then lastly, you know, we kind of had worked on a lot of these long-term outcomes and indicators, but also with COVID, where I think we saw how the need for rapid data has become really apparent. And so we were able to partner with several private sector companies and basically use their data to track several indicators like consumer spending, job posting, kind of several economic and social indicators to get a sense in real time of the impact of the crisis on our economies and on our communities, right? So kind of thinking around how do we use these other unique big data sources that, right, the data is out there, but oftentimes isn't available for public consumption. And so creating tools and creating access to that kind of data that can actually help us kind of answer some of these questions in real time that are most likely relevant to these longer term outcomes that we care about tracking as well.
Yeah, this is fascinating. So you're on the one hand working on some really long-term measurement issues, and on the other hand, trying to figure out how to measure everything faster. And I think that's using the COVID example is a really interesting point for this group, is that a lot of our data infrastructure was really built for long-term analyses. A lot of the data collections that are in the federal statistical system, for example, are every couple of years, every year that we're getting the indicators like the poverty rate. But now we have this demand for daily, weekly, monthly analysis. And so we might have to turn to some non-traditional data sources, for example. Well, Julia, you've been working on a lot of these similar themes for a while. What initiatives do you see as the most relevant for this group moving forward based on your own experience?
Well, I think you teed me up nicely, didn't you, Nick? Yeah, so I think the really important thing that we should emphasize here is this meeting is very timely. We don't have a moment to lose. The answers to these questions are urgent, and they're not academic in nature, even though this is kind of an academically oriented conference. What can we do now? Because I think you're absolutely right that our current data system is not set up to answer the kind of questions that we need to answer. And so really where people are struggling here is we've always turned for trusted data to the federal statistical system, which has been very thoughtful and very careful and high quality individuals. And the ability of the statistical system to actually think through measures that we need and provide them in a timely manner at a level of local need that's actionable is close to non-existent. Okay, so what you're hearing from Opportunity Insights and from others, kind of the work we've been doing as well, is trying to fill that gap. So what are we going to do to answer the questions that we need to have answered? Like, instead of having a national unemployment rate that measures how many people are actively looking for work in the survey week, what we need to know is, from a survey of 60,000 households, we need to know how many people are unemployed, how many people are coming close to benefit exhaustion, how many of those have families that need to be fed, what does that do to the demands for SNAP and TANF and WIC. How do we get resources to people who need them now? So that's the challenge. And what measures are going to be, and Ted McCann's presentation was fantastic. So how are we going to get measures, they may not be perfect, they may not be able to get us the most accurate measures within 2 standard errors, as Jeff Smith always used to say. I know he's here. How can we get data that are good enough and timely enough to provide evidence to make decisions? And so that's what we've been worrying about. And I think rather than starting at the beginning and saying, oh, we've got to have a data model, we've got to have measures that people are going to adopt, start with the problem and figure out what problem are we trying to solve, and then work towards developing measures, not us figuring out the measures, but having the people who are at the coalface of making the decisions saying, what measures are we going to use in order to answer the questions that are right at the crux of our thinking. From that, then we can figure out what data models are going to work and what data measures. But let's do first things first. So.
Well, and Julia, this is a good connection back to what Ted McCann offered about learning agendas being a good resource to start with the questions that you're trying to answer, and then figure out where your data gaps are. At the same time, I think you all have alluded to some data gaps in the course of this discussion that, regardless of where we end up with the learning agenda, are probably just so paramount that maybe we can spend a minute talking about those. And Julia, maybe we'll start with you, go back to David, then to Sara. where do you see our biggest data gaps? Like, is it a collection problem in a particular domain, things around unemployment, Julie, you were just alluding to, or is this more of an infrastructure problem? Julia?
Well, I think I think the people tend to focus on data because that's the thing that we can kind of control more, but the harder problem is actually trying to figure out how to get people to work with data. First of all, to get the data shared, and there's technical infrastructure investments, as you well know. What we've been doing at the Coleridge Initiative is in order to inform the Commission, we built the Administrative Data Research Facility. But then the second piece is, and what you just alluded to, is the learning agenda, which is building the capacity in state and local government agencies to understand how to build the tools and make use of the data in a sensible way. And that's where that learning agenda, and that's also what we've been doing with the applied data analytics classes. Bob Gerger talked about that in his opening keynote, the work that we've been doing funded by HHS, by ACF and OPRI, but several proud graduates from ASPE in the community, and train people how to actually work with the data and figure out what inference is valid and what inference is not. Because just having the data isn't enough, right? We're not getting, we've got to flip the whole model because we're so used to federal statistical agencies figuring out the problem, getting people, and then handing you the data and you think, oh, that's fine. Now I've got a data source. The whole problem is now flipped. We have the data, we now have to make sense of it. And it's a whole different process. Building the capacity to work with it, also to learn what other people have done, and then be able to share the data at a granular level so that the decisions that one state or local area make about, for example, defining TANF churn is shared and adopted and makes sense, is a really critical activity. So it's both the technical infrastructure to protect and share the data, and then the human infrastructure, which is training.
Very good. David?
Yeah, no, I think Julie's point is really interesting, just because something that we've seen, I'm going to channel my colleague Raj Chetty, is that, right, there's a lot of data out there. And I think especially with this COVID project, right, like the companies we're working with, right, they aren't collecting the data because of COVID. They have this data as a part of their business model, right? And so like that was already out there. It really took the conversations and thinking, oh, wow, there's this issue we're now dealing with. The type of data you have could be very relevant to what we're trying to track, and that we track in other, sometimes more inefficient ways. But it takes a lot of capacity and like thought and actual people to be able to then take that data and translate it in a way that is relevant towards policymaking. I think one, there's just the technical capacity, but I think also having, people who are able to talk to folks on the front lines doing this work, that, hey, this is the data we have. Here's our first crack at what we think might be relevant to you. But now you tell us, is this actually informative for you? Is this consumer spending data at this level actually helping you think through your policy response? So I think it's both that technical capacity, but also then being able to kind of have that back and forth with folks who actually use it.
Well, that's exactly right. And having the people at the front lines develop the products. So the training class is actually to have them scope the problems to which they want answers and go soup to nuts to developing the products that have value to them, because they're the ones who know how it needs to be, what's going to have value. So rather than coming top down and saying, here are the products that they're going to need, have it bottom up. That's why I call democratizing data.
Seems like a good segue to Sara.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, this is what we've seen time and again at the state and local level, that again, there's all sorts of data out there, but in order for it to be, again, both used by decision makers and useful to people who are actually benefiting from the programs and services that are being studied, it has to make sense. And pilot data means nothing unless it's analyzed and interpreted in a way that's transferable and useful. So a lot of the work that we've done with Results First has been training state level analysts on aspects of benefit cost analysis, because that's been the core of our work over the years. Obviously, it's a little bit different than what we're talking about today, but I think a lot of the principles remain the same. That it's key for organizations like ours to help with training, and also to connect folks and to share their lessons learned. I think less about the data itself. I know there's a lot of great programs out there or initiatives out there that help actually bridge gaps with the actual data and understanding and interpreting data, but also connecting folks in terms of skill sets, right? So to be able to understand how to analyze data in ways that is actually actionable for them is really critical.
Well, the learning agenda has come up a couple of times, and it really seems like that is a theme that we could just keep coming back to as a way of tackling a lot of the issues that you're all raising. But I want to turn to this issue of outcomes, and this is a discussion about economic mobility. It is not any single agency's job in the federal government or in state agencies to think about economic mobility. It cuts across silos. You all have done a lot of work thinking across silos. But if we were going to just, based on your own experiences, think about a couple of the key metrics, the key outcomes that the Interagency Council should be considering in its work, do you have suggestions or thoughts about what key outcomes, whether federal, state, local, tribal, you would encourage that the interagency group focus on? David, can we start with you?
Yeah, so I think something that we have focused on is specifically looking at earnings in adulthood, right? So typically we're looking at kind of folks who are, by the time they're age 30, 34, what are their earnings? And we see that, those kind of ranks are pretty stable after that. So I think oftentimes that's the default metric we use, one, because we have the data that can actually measure that, but it seems like it's a fairly objective one that I think people can get behind regardless of kind of what specific policy area they're in, right? I think oftentimes, right, we're not just worried about students' test scores, them going to college, but that's in service of them having kind of stable lives and livelihoods in the long term. So I think that's a measure that we focused on with our data pretty specifically. And I think that's what is kind of exciting about some of this surrogates work, right? Kind of figuring out, right, what are those short-term indicators that give us a better sense if a child is on track in the long term, right? Because again, like, we're all working in different policy areas, kind of focusing on different age groups. I think, we're typically not only focused on the direct impact in the short term of that program or policy, but we hope that that really is kind of showing us that this child, this population is kind of moving in a direction in the long term. So, I think it's interesting. I think there's also, that question too of, what are our goals? I think as we think through what are the most effective programs, like thinking through what are those kind of goals in the short term that we're reaching to, I think kind of has impact on how we design those programs as well.
So the good news is, if income and earnings is of interest, we have a lot of data on income and earnings that exist today, not necessarily all in a single place, but the Director of New Hires, Julia's work on LEHD, the IRS, the different state infrastructures. So there are places to go. But maybe this is a key point, that if that is a core outcome of interest, we can't make it hard or impossible to get access to that information when you need it for generating summary statistics about the population and the outcomes of interest.
So,
okay, Julia, over to you.
Yeah, so I think you can't answer that question in the abstract. Outcomes for what? What are you measuring? What is your theory of change that you're trying to affect? So you've got to have some sense. You can't just have a dashboard for an engine without having the cables going back to the micro data engine, right? So suppose that the earnings different. If I don't have a story or a theory that tells me I am going to expect that earnings are a reflection of X, Y, and Z, then it's not helpful to know what's happening with different measures. So let me give you a concrete example. There are actually some people I saw here from Kentucky Stat. So we're just doing an applied data analytics training class in that. And what's been amazing about working with that particular state and the education and labor people in the workforce investment boards in that state is, instead of just looking at the characteristics of individuals and their earnings outcomes as a function of their different education and training, what you find is their different demographic characteristics. It's very hard to change demographic characteristics without drastic surgery, right? So what they're starting to bring in is a notion that what you want to look at is both labor demand and labor supply. So why are people leaving Kentucky? Who are they? Well, you can build information from their data of the characteristics of the firms in the contiguous states, and then you've got an understanding of where the people from Kentucky are leaving. Why are nurses staying in Kentucky and STEM trained individuals leaving and going to the contiguous states? Well, the firms to which they are going are paying higher wages, right? So there's a storyline there. And then there's also a story about interventions, which is potentially better matching behavior. And that's what we're doing with the TANF class as well. But you want to have an understanding and want to have measures that fill in a theory of change and about which you can build an intervention and reallocate program resources.
Thanks, Julia. Great point. Putting on my PhD evaluator hat, theory of change always a central starting point. So very, very salient point here. Sara, thoughts on the outcomes or building on Julia's comments?
Yeah, I would just add, building on Julia's great comments there, and kind of harkening back to something she said earlier. Not only obviously do we need to connect the outcomes that we're trying to achieve and agree on what those larger outcomes are before deciding what the metrics are. It's really important to have leaders from all levels part of that conversation. So again, not just top down, but ensuring that various agency folks are represented, people in the front lines are represented, people who are responsible for providing and to some extent receiving services, so that they are connected to the things that are being tracked, and that they're responsible for tracking in some cases. So yeah, just agreeing with things stated so far, and just wanting to harken back to that point about kind of, I wouldn't say bottom up, but I believe Julia's term was data democratization. So
just as a reference, Julia put a link to her book on democratizing data in the chat box. So I encourage everybody to take a look.
Increase sales, yeah.
Well, Sara, you've given us the perfect transition to the next question about stakeholders, and just thinking through who needs to or who should be at the table for these discussions about the data, the metrics, even the theory of change, and ensuring we're getting the theory of change right. And you've just alluded to a few, particularly those at the front lines, those who might be beneficiaries. I want to open this question to everybody. Just, are there other stakeholders that you think are critical for this discussion? And then also, how should we be engaging them in this process? Sara, can you respond to the second part, since you already listed out some stakeholders? Sure.
We've seen some really creative and grassroots approaches to involving a wide variety of stakeholders at the state and local level, particularly at the county level. I think it's, in some ways, it's easier to do because folks are physically closer to each other. But it's also harder because folks are generally not as involved in this type of work. So, I think in terms of how to bring folks together, just having a variety of different engagement opportunities. So not just, a state stat meeting where only the governor and, key officials are part of it. And then other people are able to kind of send a little email here or there that's, kind of like a check the box, but not really considered. I think what we've seen being effective is just having several levels of ways to engage, whether that's formal meetings, whether that's informal brown bags, whether that's being engaged at kind of a board of supervisors meeting at the county level. So just ensuring that that there are lots of ways to engage that meet different stakeholder needs. But yeah, the provider level has really been key, especially in our state and local work.
Good. David, other thoughts on stakeholders and ways to engage?
Yeah, no, so we've done some work with the community in Charlotte that I found really interesting. I think it was something where, right, a community that has seen a lot of economic growth over the past 10, 20 years. And I think when they saw that particular stat about having low rates of economic mobility, right, so the outcomes for low-income kids in that community weren't particularly good, I think it was an interesting way to get a lot of people to the table, right? So the foundation community, the corporate community, superintendent of schools, the mayor, city manager, county executive. I think one, it was because they had a very low economic mobility rate. I think it was kind of like some common metric that made sense to everyone, regardless of their own specific policy area. And I think it was, I think they were able to use that data point to kind of talk to community members and kind of get a really broad group together. And so they ended up forming a task force with community leaders and did a lot of kind of neighborhood outreach to, one, educate folks about how they can use data and research to inform policymaking programmatic work, but also to kind of try and push a somewhat common policy agenda in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg area. So I think it was an interesting example, actually, of kind of a data point helping bring folks together to then think critically around, okay, what do we really want to look like as a community? What might be next steps, and how we actually work together now that we're kind of speaking from the same script.
Very good. Julia.
So I'm going to say obviously a lot of the data sit in state and local agencies. So figuring out who their constituencies are and producing stuff that has value to those constituencies is really important. So for example, when we built LEHD, one of the things I learned was not just to say, I've got this great measure. People would say, oh, I want information about hires at the local level and by age and sex and previous industry and so on. What I learned to say is, so that. So what you got to do is figure out who the stakeholders are, and then whose needs are important to the agencies, to the programmatic agencies. And that turned out in my case to be the workforce boards, and then by extension, the National Governors Association. So I think it's fairly context specific. It's figuring out who can really effect change if data are created and provided, who are kind of going to be the engines of that change, and what's the so that they're going to need, in other words, what products are going to be needed. And so it was the workforce boards really that pushed LEHD, and the National Governors Association that pushed LEHD over the fence. And then when we built STAR metrics to try and look at the impact of innovation and research, the key stakeholders were universities, and their representatives were AAU and APLU. And that is what kind of made stuff happen. So it's context specific. And it's the so that matters a lot.
Yeah, so that there is definitely not a shortage of stakeholders to involve in this process.
No.
This is a very long list, and particularly for the work of the interagency council as it goes forward, it also seems to suggest they have a lot of work ahead of them. But maybe one of the benefits is having a constellation of agencies with our existing relationships with different stakeholders. But it can't stop there, and this. None of you mentioned this, but since I don't work in the federal government, I'll just throw this critique out there that we can't get in the box of thinking that a federal register notice is adequate consultation with stakeholders. So like the things that you all are bringing up really require dialogue and engagement at many, many different levels, and probably more than once. That's not simple. That's not something that can happen fast. In fact, it seems very time consuming and in some ways burdensome, but productive. So in the spirit of that, and thinking, this is going to take some time, this group is charged with also moving pretty fast and getting to a work plan and some action items in years, not decades. So, thinking about your remarks so far, the stakeholder engagement, the theories of change, the data infrastructure issues, just the whole series, are there core actions that you would encourage the Interagency Council to focus on right out the gate as they're building the work plan for the next 5 years? David, starting with you.
Yeah, I think one thing that I would actually find interesting, I think the conversation around the theory of change and that statement is like, what are those for these different agencies, right? Like, what perspective are they coming from? And then where are those points of alignment? I think one of those would be pretty fascinating conversations to have, which I'm sure they do happen, but I'm probably not privy to them. But I think kind of having those conversations, seeing how those pieces align, I think would be a really interesting and important exercise. I'm just saying, hey, agency X is doing this for this reason, agency Y is doing this. But we can have some pretty common goals that we're all reaching towards. Hopefully that helps us set some metrics and kind of goals across those different lines.
Good, Sara?
Yeah, as I mentioned, we've been working with states on doing benefit cost analysis for a while now, and benefit cost analysis is definitely a long game, right? We talk about collecting data in the short term and making some estimates in terms of expected return on investment, which can often not be seen for 5 years at a minimum, and close to 20 when you're talking about things like high school graduation related to early childhood programs. So one of the things that we've seen work pretty well at the state level, and this is probably an oversimplification, but thought I'd share it anyway, is just the importance of at the state level with legislators to talk about quick wins. So just showing that you don't have to wait for 15 years to see whether or not, you do need to wait for that long to see if the ROI is actually going to play out. But there are a lot of things you can see along the way to show that you could be making progress toward that, that you don't need to wait for kind of the ultimate outcome to be unveiled to know if you're making some progress. So I would say to really figure out what some of those shorter term indicators are that continue to keep everyone bought in and engaged so that they stick with the process.
All right, Julia.
The words right out of my mouth. So get some runs on the board, right? So and I started off by saying this is urgent. We've got a major crisis going on, and I don't think we've got time to sit and deliberate. I think it's important to be deliberative, but try and get, again, with everything I've started, you throw about 10 things up against the wall, 1 or 2 of them are going to stick, and so then you kind of say, okay, that one worked, go to that. Throw some more stuff against the wall, then go to the next one. So you might have a 10 or 15 mile year journey, but you're going to figure out the pathway by testing step by step. So absolutely get some runs on the board right away.
All right, good. So if you're tuning in here, feel free to put your questions in the chat box. One that's come up is this idea that was discussed in the breakouts of potentially creating an index or maybe a series of indices that think about what well-being is across health, income, education, etc. What do you all think about that? David, sounds a little bit like some of the work that you all have been thinking about with your I forgot what it's called, the synthesis project that you were describing earlier. What about this well-being index? Good idea?
I think it's a great idea. I think it's interesting. I think especially if we look geographically, I think oftentimes when I'm talking with folks about the Opportunity Atlas or some of our different measures, I think unfortunately because of different patterns of segregation in our country, oftentimes if you're looking at someone's metric of health outcomes or different outcomes, they're all pretty similar, right? I think if you're looking at long-term income, if you're looking at health outcome, think there's a pretty high correlation with things like poverty rate, income, just because I think some of the patterns that we see in our country. But I think kind of what we're especially interested in is the interplay between a lot of these different factors. So I think kind of one, there's a conversation around, what do we value for its own sake, and thinking around how these things interrelate, right? So kind of what education indicators relate to long-term outcomes and relate to health outcomes, right? And kind of what's the underlying causal piece behind a lot of these. So I think it's an interesting idea, but I think also exploring how these different things we care about and focus on are interrelated, and then how can we impact all of them in the most effective way, I think is especially interesting.
Sara, Julia, other thoughts on the index question?
I mean, without additional context for the conversation, I would just say I certainly agree that they're all very relevant, and it's important to be able to capture things beyond just kind of the absolute measures of economic mobility. But clearly, and I don't want me to steal your words again, Julia, but ensuring that they're connected to what you're actually trying to do, and not just kind of presenting yet another level of interesting and helpful, but maybe not as useful data.
Yeah, that would be my concern. I mean, I think things like GDP are fundamentally flawed, but it's an easily understood concept. And that's why it's been so successful for the past 100 years. And one of the concerns that I have with a very complex measure is you get paralyzed before you can produce something. So that's why, David, when you talked about earnings, people, that makes sense. People are going to talk about, they're going to understand jobs, they're going to understand earnings, they're going to understand employment stability. That may not be the be all and end all, but certainly in this current environment, that might be a very good place to start, and then you can build the rest of the scaffolding around it. But it may be because I'm a labor economist. So.
Well, I know if we put on our academic hats, we can all find ways to beat up indices and find flaws and challenges. But at the same time, to Ted McCann's point about the salience that's necessary, the clarity that's necessary for policymakers, there could be some there about making the messaging easier around some of these wicked problems that we've struggled with for generations to explain to people that don't do this on a day-to-day basis. So, maybe this does merit some more exploration consistent with the theories of change. And I'll have to say, no index is ever going to be perfect. And I say that my first publication ever was an index that I some days still regret. Another question from the audience was about making the case for not relying exclusively on the federal statistical system to do a lot of the data activities that we're talking about. But the question is, what are the other options that we can think about for the federal government supporting this? And sorry, it's a long question, so I'm probably going to skip some pieces of this, but I'm going to just add, where should states fit in that? Julia?
Yeah, so I hope that one was lobbed at me, because damn it, I'm going to, and this actually ties in with the opportunity insight stuff as well. So, I always use the example, back in 1900, there was a massive hurricane that was heading towards the Gulf coasts, and the National Weather Service, which was all centralized in Washington, forecast that it was going to go to Florida. And it turned out that then the people in Galveston didn't know that it was going to hit them, and 6,000 Americans died. And as a result of that, what happened was we had local services set up throughout the country to capture local temperatures, because guess what? Having a national temperature is not particularly helpful, because it's different, it turns out, in DC and New York and Alabama and New Mexico and California. So you've got local information that's generated, and you've got multiple people in the local area generating those measures and validating them and developing it. So that approach, where the National Weather Service provides the facilities and the benchmarking, and it actually collects the data and makes it available from the local areas, but it's a decentralized approach, is something that I think we ought to be looking at. I think having a monopoly power in the production of federal data we are now seeing, it can be challenging. If we're going to have stuff that's actionable and local and replicable, you've got to have it at the local area. So we actually combine some of the UI claims data. So that's, we get it every Thursday. 2 hours later, we convert it, and the state has the information on how many people are on benefits, what are the cohorts, what's the wage replacement rates, how many people are close to the cliff of benefit exhaustion. A number of states are also wanting us to combine it with TANF data so we can get some sense of the effect on families. And then what we were able to do is take the economic opportunity data that you and Raj Chetty generated and combine that and get some sense of what's been the impact of all of these layoffs on people, families, and economic activity. I mean, crudely measured, but timely. So that's what I think we have an opportunity to change the conversation, and we can do it now. And that's where the legislation and the federal agencies should be thinking.
All right, well, speaking of doing it now, we're right out of time. But I want to ask you all one last question. Sara, you mentioned quick wins. Julia, you mentioned runs on the board. If you had to make a recommendation,
that's
or
cricket, not baseball.
Advice for the Interagency Council to do some quick wins, what would you suggest first? Sara?
Quick wins in terms of, making sure that, it has to be connected somehow to the ultimate things you're trying to achieve. So again, while you might not be able to, develop the overarching goals that, will of course iterate over time, I'd say the first thing you got to do is really just figure out what you're trying to achieve at a very basic level. Not get caught up on, outcomes and outputs and process and metrics and all that, but just really come to an understanding of what are we trying to do. And then, things will follow from there, but you've got to get that right. And that's got to be pretty early on.
All right, great. Julia?
Same thing. I think the core issue is also going to be figuring out how to get money to the states. And because right now they're operating on lousy IT infrastructures. Professional development means $1,000 a year. Build that technical and human infrastructure and incentivize the states to use data.
All right,
you
David.
Can do that.
Oh, sorry. David, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think really kind of finding those opportunities to use a national framework to kind of help people compare across places, but then to really kind of dive into support and in some sense rely on that local expertise. I think kind of finding the right ways to link those two pieces together is, I think, where we have the potential to be really impactful.
Awesome. Well, I would connect the dots across your three themes to say, if you have a learning agenda around economic mobility that has good stakeholder engagement and it's a participatory process, you can tackle a lot of this and do it very quickly. So onward, I guess. Sara, David, Julia, thank you so much for the great discussion, and we will turn it back over.